Well, good morning and welcome on this wonderful Melbourne morning to this next conversation breakfast with the Archbishop and his guests. I'm Nolene Horton, Executive Officer to the Archbishop, and as I welcome you, I also acknowledge the original custodians of the land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and their elders past and present. Virtue and Vexation, the 2013 election campaign. The nature and quality of political discourse and leadership in Australia. We are going to hear all about it. And joining the Archbishop are the Honourable Dr. Barry Jones, AO, and the Honourable Judith Troeth, AM. Judith Troeth was born and educated in Melbourne. After graduation from Melbourne University, she married and spent 30 years at Haywood, near Portland in Western Victoria. She combined farm life, raising 5 children, teaching and community activities. With Malcolm Freier as her local member, she joined the Liberal Party and progressed through the party hierarchy, including 2 unsuccessful attempts at state pre-selection. As party vice president, she nominated and was successful in being elected to the Senate in 1993. Her career spanned 18 years, including 7 years as Parliamentary Secretary for Agriculture and chairmanship of several Senate committees. She was instrumental in women's health initiatives and took a prominent role in the asylum seeker debate. She retired from Parliament 2 years ago and is now Chair of Austin Health and a committee member assisting in the organisation of the Special Olympics National Games to be held in Melbourne in October 2014. And the Honourable Dr. Barry Jones is an Australian polymath, writer, lawyer, teacher, social activist, quiz champion, and former politician. He is on the National Trust's list of Australian National Living Treasures. His political career began in the Victorian Parliament, where he represented the electorate of Melbourne as a Labor member of the Legislative Assembly from 72 to 77, when he was elected to the House of Representatives as the Labor member for the federal seat of Lalor in Victoria, which he held until his retirement in 1998. He was Minister for Science in the Hawke government. He also served as the ALP National President. In 1999, he was appointed an adjunct professor at Monash University and became a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne in 2005. Now please welcome the Archbishop, Judith Troeth, and Dr. Barry Jones.
Well, thank you, Nolene, and it's nice to see everyone here, and what a beautiful morning to be here on the edge of the river. It's just a great time of year to enjoy being in Melbourne. Well, this has got to be which probably feels like to most people, the longest election campaign they've ever endured. How did it feel for you, Judith? When did it feel it started for you?
Probably in February, Archbishop, when the previous Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, announced that the election would be on September 14th, this coming Saturday, and I think most of us mentally prepared ourselves for the onslaught that was to follow, and it did follow, and instead of there being any carefully defined period when the election is on, the on button was on, I think, for the next 7 months.
Yeah, I think it had that feel, didn't it? And it's felt unrelenting all year. Feel that same way to you, Barry?
Well, I think it was worse than that. I think the election actually began in 2009.
Yes.
and you had in 2 phases. Phase 1 was 2010 with an inconclusive result, but the election campaign, and in a sense they were almost in campaigning mode over that very, very long period. And it just meant that it transformed the nature of politics in part. Every act was an act of attrition, and there were no prisoners to be taken. And it brought about a kind of, I could almost use the word savagery, but it certainly brought about an ugly element in our public life. And I'd say on both sides.
Well, I think, Barry, you've written recently, do you think this has been one of the most savage campaigns? Just tell us why you think that.
Well, simply from my own experience, having been in the party for, I have to confess, 60 years, and having been a very close observer of the political process for, half a century and so on, when I talk to people, well, we'll say like Malcolm Fraser, who you mentioned before, or when I talk to people like Hawke and Keating and so on, there were pretty robust exchanges, but they didn't quite have the venom, they didn't have that toxicity that we've now come to accept as absolutely natural and normal. And in a way, if you go back, you can see that I don't want to go into the Rudd-Gillard problem, except just in passing to say that I think it had a transforming effect on Australian public life, and it underlined what I think of as the maxim that we can never forgive those that we've injured. That if you've really injured somebody very seriously, you find it very hard to say, oh, it really was their fault, and, don't blame me. And you can see that in a way that what happened in the coup of June 2010, it didn't just have an adverse effect on Kevin Rudd, but it also had an adverse effect on Julia Gillard. And I think it had an adverse effect on the whole political process, the way the Parliament operated, the kind of vindictiveness that became commonplace. I think we've had a kind of debasing of the whole political process in recent years. And when I go back and I think of the terrible periods at the time of the Labor split in the 1950s, and even the controversies around 1975 with the dismissal, it didn't have that kind of deep personal dislike that is now so characteristic of public life.
Well, it's interesting because I think, Judith, you don't actually rate this as the lowest point, do you, this campaign?
No, I don't, Archbishop. Certainly one of the lowest points. But certainly I became very interested in politics in 1975, and the deep personal vitriol directed at Malcolm Fraser, and from then onwards, I think the rise of cartoonists and their work in national newspapers, particularly the Australian being a national newspaper. I'm not singling it out for special attention, but rather than having state-based newspapers, the work of the Australian was carried right across the country. The rise of television as a political medium and the way in which that operated to hold politicians up to ridicule, and I'm thinking particularly of John Howard and Bob Hawke and the rubbery figures that were done by Peter Nicholson in that show during the 1980s. And when I entered Parliament in 1993 and 1996, when the Howard team gained government, certainly the vilification of John Howard that went on and on and on at him as a person, both mentally and physically. I think this last campaign was no worse. It was certainly what I had come to expect in the depiction of public figures.
I was interested to read just about a week ago Professor Tony Cody, who wrote in The Age, and amongst a number of things, he's talking from a background of philosophy and ethics, that the way in which Julia Gillard was depicted as a liar for breaking a promise was a bad principle and a bad use of language, that he's saying there's a big distinction between lying and making a commitment and then changing a mind on a commitment. Do you think that we're allowing a kind of a looseness of of language come in that we all sort of tolerate because we kind of enjoy seeing the emotional energy of political contesting being raised?
Well, I think one of the problems relates specifically to that issue was that I do think that the whole issue of climate change was very badly handled after 2010. You remember that the original plan in the 2010 election had been that there was going to be a popular assembly, and that popular assembly was going to meet, and that was going to make recommendations, and that the government would then consider what the popular assembly recommended on climate change. And I think that the context in which she said there'll be no carbon there'll be no carbon pricing under a government I lead, I think that was in the context of saying unless this assembly, recommends, and then we'll consider it very carefully. In other words, we're not proposing it. We'll wait for in the end, the whole idea of the popular assembly was regarded as not being a very brilliant idea, and it was dropped. It wasn't. And then came the process of negotiation. But I think that there was a bad failure to explain, to say, look, circumstances have changed. When the election was on, I thought we'd have a mandate. I thought we'd be able to follow the certain processes. In fact, that's all changed. And now we're faced with a new situation. And I'm sorry if I give the impression of having misled you on this, but I'm faced with no real alternative. And what I'm going to do is negotiate what I believe to be a proper outcome. But in fact, the whole carbon pricing issue, in fact, the whole climate change issue, was handled in an extraordinarily bad way, I think partly because on both sides, either willfully or through failure to do their homework, neither side really understood the science, and it was seen simply as a purely political issue, and indeed an economic issue. Will the effect of the carbon pricing make businesses uncompetitive? Will it raise the price of electricity to the domestic consumer? Rather than saying, look, Australia is the #1 per capita carbon emitter, CO2 emitter in the world, has got a kind of moral obligation to take a lead. Even though we can't do anything on our own, we can at least take a lead, and then that may help us to assist other countries or persuade other countries that they should act.
In Judith's
insight, very badly handled.
I'm interested in Judith's insight on this because, in a sense, when you're in, as you were, a very long drought, the argument seems uncontestable. But when weather patterns return to more what you expect, do you sort of think, is that why the interest in climate change has sort of dropped off, do you think?
I think it's a very important factor. Yep. Sorry.
No, I'm just remembering that as a farmer for 30 years and gazing out the window at very brown and yellow paddocks and wondering if it would ever rain, certainly that aspect was in my mind without pretending to be a scientist of any type, but being involved in the agriculture industry at the time, I did take some counsel on this, and I came to the conclusion that in my mind, statistics for heat and drought were certainly rising, and I was prepared to accept that we needed to do something about this. I wouldn't go as far as Kevin Rudd and say that it was the greatest moral issue of our time, which I think elevated it to a great degree. I think it was the very close timing between Julia Gillard saying we will never have a carbon tax and then saying we will have a carbon tax that really imprinted this on the voting population's attention. But I would take you back to the early 90s when the Hewson party, or the Liberal Hewson-led Liberal Party, advocated a 760-page volume on the GST. And the slogan against that was, if you don't understand it, don't vote for it. Now, for that and other reasons, the Liberal Party did not gain government in 1993. We did get in 96. In between then and the 98 election, we had the Asian financial crisis, and again, for a variety of reasons, John Howard, who had said that we will never have a GST, announced that we did have a GST, but that was announced as part of the election program so that people had a chance to vote on it. And I think if you're not given a chance to give your opinion on something, it probably has more resonance with the electorate about a broken promise than something which you and I are able to pass our verdict on. But there certainly have been things stated by politicians that come to pass later on, and really I don't know that anyone is surprised, but there are ways and ways of handling it.
I think Rudd made a fundamental error in not going for a double dissolution in 2010, because he thought that when Malcolm Turnbull was the Liberal leader, that there could be a political fix and you didn't have to involve the Greens at all. And once Malcolm Turnbull had gone and Tony Abbott came in as a climate change denier, then the political fix wasn't going to be possible. And I think what happened, frankly, I think there was simply a failure of nerve on his part. He was so distressed by what had happened in Copenhagen and the fact that he saw the Copenhagen conferences really having fallen in a heap. And he had a number of people around him who were saying to him, don't do it, don't go for that double dissolution. But if he had, I think on the balance of probabilities at that stage that he would have won.
Yes, I think he would have won because although you might remember that Tony Abbott gained the leadership by one vote, and certainly there was, if not turmoil, disquiet in the Liberal Party about the way that that decision had been taken. On the Monday we were voting for the ETS, on the Tuesday all positions were changed and we were not voting for the ETS apart from myself and one other brave female Queensland Senator, Sue Boyce, who did vote for the ETS, but because the Greens in an amazing turnaround voted against it, as they were always going to, the whole thing fell in a heap. So it is strange how accidents of history work themselves out.
But you're giving us some insight into, I guess, how the thinking of a campaign operates. You've got this question about, the capacity of the public to be truly informed in a way that they feel they're informed about policy. You've got the other views that seem to prevail, that people have their own quite personal economic interests at heart and they're looking for some outcomes there. As people sit around and work out election policy strategy, what are the kind of things that go through the minds of those who are planning these things, and whether for 3 years or 1 year, what kind of factors have been coming into play?
Well, it's a brave policymaker who says that no one will be worse off. That is a very brave statement to make, because in nearly every economic argument there will be winners and losers. So you probably should not do that. But the main, I think, to me, when thinking about policies for agriculture, was that it would put the industry, and by which I mean agriculture and every other industry, on a better, more sustainable economic footing, so that I would hope it needed less government handouts afterwards rather than before, that it could sustain itself, and also would it be for the good of the industry as a whole. Now, I think you can take that principle to work for the car industry, the healthcare industry, whatever other industry you care to name. And as far as I can see, most policymakers, if not the responsible ministers, tend to take that point of view. Is it better economically for the industry, and does it mean less reliance on the government? So I would hope that that's what it means.
I'd take a somewhat different emphasis. I think one of the tragedies at the moment is that the people who really run both political parties, both major political parties, have formed the judgment that in our compulsory voting system, that the the election outcome is really determined by maybe 20% of the population who are the least engaged in the issues, least engaged in ideas, and they take the view, I think it might be exaggerated, but take the view that really they can't be expected to concentrate on detail. They don't need to be explained. They need to be captured in the same way that normal advertising for products captures it. And so if you can find a slogan that's catchy, well, that will do. So the result is, I thought particularly low point. This is why I disagree slightly with Judith over some of those earlier election campaigns, is that we'd got used to the idea of the three-word slogan. But then after a while, it started to be the one-word slogan repeated 3 times. You see, that you'd say that instead of it, once it was stop the boats, and then later on you see it was cut, cut, cut. Yeah. And then it was lie, lie, lie. And I thought, well, we're going to get down, you've got down to the one-syllable thing. What's the next step? How simple do you get? And you see, when you look back, say, at the period of Gough, nobody ever complained about Gough that he never explained things. Quite the contrary.
Well, the same thing could be said for Kevin Rudd.
But he'd go, well, in a somewhat different way. Gough, but anyway, Gough would go on, and I reflect. You see, I've got to tell you, I hosted a lunch for Gough and Malcolm a few months ago, or no, a couple of years ago, here in Melbourne, and they had a great time, and what intrigued me particularly, how many common enemies they had. It was very, and I thought, low, this looks pretty good. And they couldn't have been more jovial with each other. Could you imagine a convivial lunch involving Tony Abbott, Julia Gillard, and Kevin Rudd?
No.
Not really. I think you'd really need to have a Borgia around to be part of it.
But given the effluxion of 25, 30 years, I mean, this is 40 years on after the dismissal.
You're not just saying because we're old chaps.
No, definitely not. So given the effluxion of 40 years, Kevin at 95, Tony...
They might be very relaxed. Yes, that's true.
Tony at 90 may well be very relaxed.
I could see that.
Yes.
But I think most people are aware of that in a sense there is... I suppose if you stop people in the street and you say, do all the passions and emotions during an election campaign represent the real state of that person and their enduring awareness? They'd probably say, no, of course not. They're amplifying up. They're turning up the emotion. They're turning up the rhetoric because they think that we've got our attention turned down, which I think is your point about the 20%.
Well, Jeff Kidney, who I must say, I think Kidney's probably done the most consistently interesting and thoughtful political commentary, writes for the Financial Review over the election campaign, perhaps followed by Laura Tingle, but Jeff Kidney's been very good. And he made the point, I don't want to sound partisan in this, but he was making the point that Abbott is the politician you vote for if you don't like politicians. That in a sense, the Abbott message, to some extent, was, you don't like politics, you're not interested in the issues, well, that's all right, vote for me. I'm not going to burden you with a lot of massive detail about stuff. And in a sense, not releasing the financing for the Liberal promises turned out to be a masterstroke in the end, because a lot of people said, no, we don't want to hear all that stuff. It's not of any interest to, we're not going to follow it. And so, in a way, it wasn't exactly John Howard's relaxed and comfortable phrase, but it was somewhat similar to say, don't worry if you can't get involved in the political process. A lot of people aren't. Stay out of it. Just turn up and vote on Saturday.
On the other hand, Tony Abbott did, and I'm not preaching purely partisan, but Tony Abbott did put paid parental leave out front and centre to be debated, and that was probably one of the policies that caused the most discussion and dissension during the election. So in that sense, he made that the flag bearer of himself and invited people to judge him because of it. So,
to the horror of the economic rationalists
indeed.
in this party.
Well, I think it is consistent in a sense, isn't it, that we're seeing something of the rise of celebrity candidates or candidates who bring into an election campaign a lot of awareness. That's happened over a couple of elections. I think you're seeing, and I don't know if it's happening anymore, but people being part of a lot of more popular culture events. If you look at some of the ABC comedy programs, you had, in effect, serious politicians showing up on the hamster wheel and other kind of things, which seems to show a great craving for just recognition and
Didn't do Bob Catter any good.
Well, they seemed. I saw that one. He seemed remarkably wooden, and why am I here? What have my mind has told me to do in coming to this thing? But the willingness. I'm sure Menzies wouldn't have done that.
You couldn't. No, quite right. No, he wouldn't have. That wouldn't have been his thing.
I suspect none of Bob Catter's constituents would have watched that particular show. In that sense, his vote was not.
Well, he still had a swing against him, so perhaps some of them did up there in Mount Isa or somewhere.
Well, they'd have been out crutching sheep or something or other.
But just talk for a moment about this, the rise of I suppose, the celebrity candidate, the Clive Palmer getting more than 10% of the vote in Queensland and Western Australia, and we'll come on to it a bit later, but the rise of
and the senator in Tasmania.
Yes. Yeah. So how do you account for that? Is this like an anti-politician? Are these the anti-politician?
I think so.
Well, I think politicians these days, particularly in the younger groups who are coming through, feel the need to connect on that very loose term, social media. So when you think that Q&A involves what I think is Twitter running along the base of the screen, the hamster is full, the Chaser show is full of social media references. Any politician worth their salt these days uses Twitter. They want to be seen to be connected to the social media and connected to those younger groups of voters. So to my mind, they have to be out there to some extent, but the danger is that you become overexposed and people see you as a showbiz celebrity rather than a serious policy maker. And I think, the line is somewhere in between. You wouldn't want to overdo it, I suspect.
Do you think you'd do, if you were in political life now, would you do those kind of appearances that are more gimmicky?
I have made an involuntary appearance on The Chaser, which was an absolute disaster. They cornered me in a committee room and put a hypothetical question to me, which, because I wasn't very well informed, I believed, and there ensued an absolutely very embarrassing interview, which I would rather forget. You have to be, this was a long time ago, you have to be well prepared and you have to be on the ball. I would pick and choose. For instance, I'm having a conversation with the Archbishop, aren't I?
You are.
So from that point of view, I think you pick and choose where you go, and for me, myself, I would sooner do the serious stuff rather than the trivial stuff.
So, because some of this, I wondered, you become cynical. This is a great danger of watching these things and being part of observing too many election campaigns, but I wondered in the debate between Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd, when Tony Abbott said, this guy keeps talking or something, whether that was in fact spontaneous, you think, or is this something that someone's researched from a previous presidential debate, and they've said, slip this in because this will actually get you some cut through, this will be remembered as a kind of a summary of something. Am I sort of succumbing to too much cynicism in life?
I don't know the cynicism, but they would see, if you were looking at the very characteristics of Rudd's personality and Rudd's style and so on, there would be that sense that he does make the occasional use of the first singular pronoun and that he is somewhat prolix. And therefore, it was easy to attack him. What was more fascinating was to see that a comment by Tony Abbott then became a a front-page news
Yes,
story. In
yes.
fact, the entire front page of the Daily Telegraph in Sydney was covered by that. This guy never shut up. That's one of the great problems, that once you would say, well, it was the role of newspapers to provide a variety of material, and you looked at it and you speculated about the implications of this article and that article, and then you drew your own conclusion. The trouble is, if you simply present the news as a form of advocacy, particularly big megaphone advocacy, where you're really shouting out, then it really perverts and certainly distorts the whole nature of political debate.
I guess one area, Judith, I might just take you onto is that one of the consequences of this kind of an election campaign, of the megaphone keeps things simple, is that the profound difficulty in actually implementing what seem to be policies when you actually come into government. Do you see that there's going to be a hangover legacy that Tony Abbott and his government will have of being actually held accountable to what may be unworkable policies? Stop the boats, for instance, sounds to me a fairly unworkable policy.
Yes, I would agree with you on that particular issue. I think stop the boats is very unworkable. But on other issues, what Tony Abbott has claimed is a new start. The size of his victory in the House of Representatives, at least, would be seen to be some sort of mandate, and the fact that there's been a strong Liberal swing, even in many Liberal-held seats, is, I believe, an affirmation of most of the voting population's agreement that the Liberals should be in government and that obviously Tony Abbott will be Prime Minister. Much is not, when I don't mean it in any subterfuge method, but much of election policy that is implemented after an election is unstated in the election campaign. You will find that broad statements will be made about taxation, broad statements will be made about this, that and the other, and underneath that is a plethora of detail that's implied in the leading statement. And I don't mean that anyone is setting out to deceive anyone, but the point is that if you approve of this, therefore we'll be doing that. And I think some things will flow from this election victory that we'll see being implemented in the next little while. Obviously, stop the boats, change the carbon tax, and whatever will flow from that. And I imagine they'll be very high on the government's agenda.
Barry, you've said that, I think you said in your article, does Joe Hockey really believe what he's saying? I hope not. He certainly would not want to be questioned or sign an affidavit about it.
Well, this was if you saw the election ads that Joe Hockey was doing, you really got the impression that the Australian economy was a kind of a burning ruin. That there was, and that in particular, his closing words in one of the ads was to say that the rest of the world is waiting for Australia to turn the lights back on. And when you reflect, you have to say, well, hang on. How many other nations in the world have got AAA credit ratings from all the major agencies? How many of them have been praised by the IMF and by Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, as having had the best way of handling the GFC of any country, with low unemployment rates comparatively, low interest rates and all the rest of it? That doesn't sound like a kind of burning ruin. And yet, one of the problems, I think, is that there's no doubt that a very high proportion of voters were absolutely spooked about the state of the economy, and they were convinced that the economy was in dreadful shape. Now, the point is that if somebody says to you, day after day, says, you're not looking very well, you're not looking very well. Now, it could be that even if you had somebody with an even larger sense of self-confidence, even if you said to Archbishop Pell day after day after day, George, you're looking terrible. After a while, he might start to say, hang on, maybe I'm not feeling so good. So the result is a lot of people really were spooked by the idea, that sense that the Australian economy was in a kind of free fall. And that was absolutely, totally wrong.
So Joe Hockey's performance as Treasurer won't have to be stellar to be changing that rhetoric then?
Well, I wouldn't think so. And the point is, you see, that where they said there was anything good, they said it was all due to what had happened under Howard and Costello. And I don't disregard the importance of Howard and Costello, just as Howard, to be fair to Howard, gave some credit to
Yes,
Hawke and
correct.
Keating.
Yes.
And what I'm looking forward to next year is to say, next year when the budget comes up, when Hockey says we've got a AAA rating, and we owe it all to the achievement of the Rudd and Gillard governments. You think he'll say that, won't he?
I'll give it a few more years, I think, Barry. It might take a little bit longer to reach that happy state of peace.
I think one of the other questions as regards the economy is, I think we really got to the turning point in this election about whether or not we continue to support manufacturing industries like the car industry. Now, over the last 3 years, Ford have announced a definition point for their continuance in Australia. Holden are certainly looking at the same questions, and we had a stark contrast of the Rudd government giving, I think, 500 million or billion, these all blur, to the car industry, and the coalition saying that there would be a stop to assistance for the car industry. Now, this is one of the questions that both sides of politics have been battling with for many years, not only the car industry, but also manufacturing in general. We've always been told that we have to get clever, get smart, manufacture the things that we're good at, but for many manufacturers, it's a case of suspiciously looking at the rest of the world and thinking, what are they going to start manufacturing that I am manufacturing now, and they won't be able to compete. Now, that is a really big question. It means employment, it means investment, and it probably means the attention of the government. So apart from, I agree, the scare campaign that was run on the economy, I think there are some much bigger questions to be asked.
Well, look, the thing I find absolutely weird, that there were 2 or 3 terrible omissions on both sides. One was there was no serious discussion about taxation at all. The government failed to follow up on the outgoing government failed to follow up on the Henry Review, and I thought the assertion by the coalition to say that you'd have better services at lower cost and lower taxing as well was absurd. You can't have all those 3 propositions, particularly in the context of an increasingly aging population, and yet it was never really challenged. The other thing was the eerie silence about our research capacity and about our universities. You know, it's extraordinary. We heard a lot about apprenticeships, and that's fine. We heard nothing whatever about the university sector. I may have missed it. I don't think there was a syllable uttered on either side, and that's a disgrace.
Yes, I agree that the McKeon report, which came out earlier in the year, I was at a breakfast with Simon McKeon and also Peter Dutton, the Health Minister, and particularly asked them, in view of my present position as Chair of the Austin, what attention will be given to this. And Peter Dutton did say what a good report it was, and this, that and the other, but like you, that research, as I've known in agriculture and as you and I would certainly agree in education and certainly in health, simply has to happen. If we're going to be a clever nation, we need to do something about it.
So with the growth of the National Party vote, Katter, Palmer, I guess, he's probably a protectionist, but you seem to have a growing protectionist kind of intuition that's going to be present in this government for the next 3 years.
It always, I think you would find it always has had, and that's the difference between probably the Liberal Party and the National Party. The National Party from Blackjack McEwen, I think, have always been in favour of subsidies to rural industries, which beyond a certain level I don't agree with. We actually have quite low subsidies now to rural industries. I think some 4% of a farmer's income in Australia comes from government subsidy, and as you would know, in the US it's something like 35% or more of a farmer's income. Now, that has to be kept in check. Any sort of unneeded subsidies that are not needed, and that was why I was astounded when Kevin Rudd raised the idea of the economic zone for the Northern Territory, because that was floated several times as an economic zone for New South Wales and so on by the National Party when we were in government, and firmly excluded from any sort of implementation.
Yes, but that was a Wednesday that he raised it.
Yes, it was a Wednesday.
And but one of the things I'm particularly looking forward to with interest is the tension which must arise surely between the Prime Minister-elect's economic views and the views of the free marketeers around him, because there's no doubt that Tony Abbott belongs to that, very much to that Santa Marian tradition of interventionists, the whole idea of the kind of social world of rerum novarum to a large extent. And he's an interventionist from way back, and when he was Minister for Health, you'd have to say he was a big spender. And it's going to be interesting to see what sort of tensions there are between those sort of hard money men, which he's not. And I think one of the grave mistakes that Labor made in attacking Abbott earlier on was to see him as being a sort of a hard man, a tough man on economic issues. And in fact, what you find the criticism by some of his colleagues is that he's all over the shop economically, because he really belongs to that Santa Marian tradition.
So what about the emergence of, in the Senate, the micro parties, representatives who will be in the Senate as Judith was, with very few primary votes?
The Roo-Poo hurling vote.
He's now a senator for Victoria.
Now a senator for Victoria. We've got to be more respectful. It is. No, I think it's an absolute horror show. It's clear that in New South Wales, where the Liberal Democrats got nearly 9% of the primary vote because they happen to be number one on the above the line thing. Now that suggests a level of exhaustion by the voters to say, oh, it's a bit of an effort even to put the figure one and find it on top of the line. Well, I better start at the end. Oh, Liberal, that sounds all right. Yeah, well, one,
Best of
bingo,
all worlds.
done it. Away you go. Terrible stuff, you see, and... But the other thing was, I was talking to somebody the other day who said, oh, I'm a great believer in animal justice, and I voted for the Animal Justice Party. But then, when you look at the animal justice declared, the preference, right, you find that they're giving their preferences to smokers' rights, to the climate change skeptics, to the motor enthusiasts, and so on. Whole collection of odd things, and people say, oh, I thought I was only voting for animal rights. And you have to say, you don't want people who are too cynical, but you say, no, you're not. You think you're voting for animal rights, but you're voting for a whole number of rather dark characters that you've never heard of, don't know anything about, and wouldn't want to be so.
I can imagine that's going to be awkward for people who don't come from a political background, or even, perhaps a terribly informed background about politics, to actually take their place in the Senate, because it's a chamber which has significant business, it has its own traditions, it has people who are very well informed. That's going to be not an easy thing for these people to go through.
It has many committees, many of whom are charged, of course, with the review of legislation, which is then collated in a report and presented in the Senate and spoken about to give the committee's view of that legislation. Now that's a very important part of it, and while one is educated along the way by experts who come and speak to the committee, you do need a reasonable amount of knowledge of community life or any other sort of life to actually go on that committee. So I'm not disputing that. I'm sure these are all excellent people, but I've been thinking myself about all. And whether to raise, as we discussed yesterday, Archbishop, the way to get around this, one way would be to raise the deposit needed, which everyone needs to pay if they nominate. At the moment, it's $500 for every person who has to pay that to put your name in for the election. Now, I would hate it to get to levels such as America, where I was greeted with awe and reverence because the starting point to be elected to the Senate in America is $30 million US, which you need to have. I don't mean as a rule, but that's about what it takes to get into the Senate. The other thing is, of course, that some of these people have, some of these parties have registered with the absolute minimum of members, minimum of constitution, minimum of sensibility, and whether or not we should make sure that the parties who register are properly constituted and reach a certain constitutional level of numbers of members and so on. On the other hand, this is our exercise in democracy, and if people choose to vote in that way, who are we to say that the country's off on the wrong track?
It's interesting that Nick Xenophon, I think, has said overnight that he thinks optional, preferential, below-the-line voting. So if you have 6 senators to elect, you could, if you could number 1 to 6 and forget the rest, and that would be a valid vote. He thinks that would be a compromise to allow people to appear there, but stop the preference harvesting. Look, we're at a point where we want to throw it open to you. Have you seen something virtuous? Are you vexed about the election campaign? This is your chance to well, not so much to tell us. We'd rather we had a question, and Nolene will lead us through on that. And there are some microphones around, but I think we'll take the questions in groups of 3. So Nolene, over to you.
So, firstly, Graham.
Graham Pratt, I live in Glen Iris. Thank you for your wonderful comments. I've enjoyed it immensely, Barry and Judith. There's a saying that war is too serious a business to be left to the generals. I put it to you that the whole issue of climate science has such profound implications, is far too serious a business to be left to the way the politicians are handling it and the way that the tabloid media is handling it. It has been trivialised and demonised, and rationality and common sense have gone out the window. Now, I'm not putting a particular line. I ask you both, have been involved in public life. We cannot ignore this issue. How can we get a public debate that is sensible and rational, where the average person can come to grips with it without being influenced by absurd, nonsensical propositions?
We'll have them in groups.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
Kenneth Lay, I'm the Vicar of Aberfeldy. Judith, you brought up the comment of mandate. And it seems to me that that's a problem. And we're going to hear it over and over again with such a large swing in the lower house that we now have a mandate to do everything. If we look at the voting things, we say there might have been 10 issues, and I might have liked 8 of them and hated 2. I'm going to vote for the party that's got the most issues that I agree with. But does that implicitly mean that I've agreed with the other ones simply because they've got there? You can't have a mandate for everything that you put up, just by common sense, surely. But what else can you do? I don't know.
thank you. And there was one more nearer the front. Yes.
My name, Kishore. I wonder if our voting system has turned the roles of the House of Representatives and Senate the wrong way round. The House of Representatives should be very broadly representative, but the outcome of the Senate seems to indicate that it seems what Keating called the unrepresentative swill may be the true representation of the society with large sprinkling of nuts.
Thank you.
I wonder if we need to change that so that the House of Representatives is truly representative and Senate is a representative of the states.
Thank you. So we have the 3 questions, which are, firstly, is climate change too serious to leave to the journalists and public debate? Secondly, the question of mandate to do everything. And thirdly, the issue of the House of Representatives and the Senate, is it the wrong way round?
And Barry, I think you're ready to say something.
Well, look, first of all, on the climate change thing, there are several issues that come up. One is the conflict between evidence and opinion. You know, somebody says, well, I have evidence, and somebody else says, yes, but I have strong opinions. Now, the problem is, in a democratic community, the view is that every view, every vote is of equal value, maybe every opinion is of equal value. So what if somebody's campaigning will say against vaccination for children? Say, I'm entitled to my opinion. Well, in a democratic sense, you are. And if you say, I've got a strong commitment that I believe all scientists are frauds and they're essentially spinning a line in order to get research grants and so on, well, that's a democratic view, and it's very difficult to take an authoritarian line and say, no, that's a completely legitimate view and you can't do it. I agree, governments have got to take risks and say, and they've got to keep explaining, and I think the level of explanation has been terrible on both sides, and I think complicated. I mean, nobody really pointed to the oddity of having a climate change minister, Greg Combet, who represented a coal seat. And I couldn't imagine Combet going out to his electorate and saying, look, bad luck, but we're going to wind up your industry. You know, we've got to get to a post-fossil fuel situation. Now, look, I better shut up and maybe Judith will handle the other issue.
For Barry to answer the three.
No, you react to some of them.
Yeah, well, I'm a firm believer in evidence. Barry has outlined the situation very correctly. There are opinions, certainly, but when I see some of the opinions expressed through letters to the editor or, trivial comments, I'd still sooner go back to the science. It was unfortunate that at the very start of the climate change debate, we had a whole level of the scientific community devoted to debunking climate change, and for a while that was very persuasive. Now, I've come, for myself, I'm a firm believer in the evidence, and I believe that probably the best policy would be a combination of what the Coalition calls direct action, planting trees, limiting our own emissions, that sort of thing, combined with national action, whatever that may turn out to be. But certainly it's with us, and I think we should do something about it.
And just you mentioned that question of mandate. I think would you like to respond to that?
Yes, certainly.
That principle.
A mandate. I think you would have to accept that you either say, well, perhaps the election wasn't real, in which case, we're going to be hesitant about what we're doing, or you have to accept that the majority of voters voted for you, and that idea of the mandate is not to do everything you want. The bill, any of the action that will be taken by the government, bills are put into the Parliament, they're extensively discussed in the House, they are passed in the House because the government has the majority, they go to the Senate where they undertake a period of extensive review, and then they are debated in the Senate. Now, I always encourage lobby groups to lobby until the last minute, until up to the third reading of that bill in the Senate, because there are and will be changes that have been made to bills as the result of public opinion, and certainly I think that our process is democratic in a reasonably satisfactory way for the mandate to be tempered.
Could I just say something about the mandate? I mean, every government says we have a mandate, and every opposition says no, we don't. And of course, when Whitlam came in, he said, I've got a mandate, and the coalition said, no, you don't. And to give an illustration, if you take the 1998 election, Howard won, this is on the GST, Howard won a majority of seats in the House of Coast and say, I've got a mandate. Did he win a majority of votes? Well, actually, he didn't win a majority of votes. Beazley, I mean, you may say he got the wrong votes in the wrong places and so on, but Beazley actually won. If there'd been a referendum on the issue, Beazley would have won it. So that it means that the whole question, you say, well, there's a mandate if you're simply looking at seats in the House. There's not a mandate if you're simply looking at aggregate vote. It's a very dubious question.
Which I think brings us on to our other question about the relative role of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Because I suppose there was an earlier period in Australian political history where it seemed that the Senate was more the state's house according to the Constitution. It was relatively benign. It certainly respected, didn't have any activist or initiating role. But clearly, as political balances have changed, that scenario has changed entirely. Do you see that? The constitutional roles, of course, are unchanged. But do you see that there is the relative importance of the Senate compared to the House has changed, and is that an enduring reality?
Well, naturally, I believe that the Senate does have a state's role, and I've seen that evidenced in much of my time. The House of Representatives is truly representative. It has a member for each electorate, and the numbers in those electorate, by virtue of the Electoral Commission, are kept relatively close, so that you have one vote, one value, and no electorate outweighs another. So you have 150 people in the House of Representatives all discussing national problems. And that's what I see as its role. The Senate, on the other hand, as well as being the state's house, is a house of review, and that's where the Senate committees were so important. And, I didn't always agree with the result, but I can assure you that by the time the bill reached the third reading in the Senate, I was always comfortable that every single aspect of that bill had been debated to death, and that we all knew a great deal about that bill, and that on the numbers in the Senate, which from now on may or may not represent the true will of the Australian people, but that vote would happen. Now, it's often for different reasons that, the smaller parties vote on opposing sides, but by and large, I'm happy with the way things are.
So, more questions?
Leonie Bird from Hawthorn. I found it more disturbing in this recent election that suddenly there seemed to be a poll-driven agenda, and also we were hinted at constantly there were focus groups, whoever they were. My concern is that in fact other influences such as polls really can set an agenda which can veer either a government or an opposition into wayward ways that really confuse them and don't make for good government. I would like to hear your opinions about this new prevalence of poll-driven discourse.
Thank you.
George Powell, formerly Technical Education. I am very concerned about who we are and what we are. We're born with no choice. That's nature. Choice is our concern thereafter. And where do we get our evidence from, or our thoughts for the future? I reflect on Toffler, I reflect on Barry's Sleepers Awake, I reflect on McEwen, who said the media is the message, and some misconstrued that the media is the massage. It seems to me our choice is captivated and held by the media. I'd like some expression from our two former members of Parliament, how much they see the media controls our choice.
Thank you.
Alex Wood, largely retired medico. The Senate is really a very great concern to me. I was handing out things for Get Up on Saturday, and I went round to all the parties and said, could you give me your Senate ticket? And there was no indication where the preferences would flow at all. I happened to be overheard by the lady in charge of the booth where I was, and she said, I can give you that. So I looked at it before I voted, and I was appalled that I think two people had three separate flows of votes, and several other groups had two separate flows of votes. In other words, there was no clear definition, if you voted one, where it would go. Let's say, I can't remember, but I think perhaps the Greens had three. But let's say I voted for the Greens, it could go in one of three directions. So in other words, if I were Clyde Palmer, I could probably run a case against the validity of the Senate. And I think we need more direction from the two politicians, if they're able, to indicate how we should make it much more simple so we could do it effectively.
Thank you very much. So the questions are, do we have a poll-driven focus group influenced media and agenda? The second question, is the media the message? And finally, do we need a clearer understanding and definition of what voting for the Senate means? And when we saw that voting paper last week, how to make it clearer and where the preferences would go, we'd like your advice, please.
I think certainly, as they're reported in the press, I think the polls reflect the feeling of the electorate in small, isolated circumstances. But one shouldn't obviously take the message from polls too seriously because it can be misconstrued. I kept reading during the last 9 months that if the Labor primary vote dropped to below a certain figure, that Julia Gillard was certainly gone. And I think the magic number this time, as it turned out in the election, was about 33%. If the Labor primary vote was going to be below 33%, either for the party or for the leader, all hope was lost. Now, I do remember a bulletin cover from the 1980s which had a picture or a caricature of John Howard saying, "Mr. 18%, why does this man bother?" Well, the future proved why he did bother, but I don't believe that polls make people think a certain way. I think they reflect that. I know there are focus groups and I know there are other groups, and they're always going to be only a small slice of what actually happened. So when I look at a poll that's published in the newspaper, I think, well, you know, do I believe that, or that's probably wrong? But I don't know that for people who are undecided that points them in the way of actually doing it.
Certainly, if you're performing poorly on the polls, the answer seems to be the only poll that matters is on election day.
Correct.
Oh,
yes. Very wise.
Well, I'm so sick of hearing that cliche. I mean, it does provide some useful information, but there's a negative side to both, particularly with focus groups, that I think it tends to paralyse leaders, and they get into a panic very easily. They get into a panic every fortnight. What has been particularly bad has been those focus groups conducted in Penrith and other areas in Western Sydney on issues like asylum seekers. And the results of the focus groups have been absolutely appalling in the level of what appears to be the level of hatred generated against asylum seekers. And the result is that you get the result of those focus groups, the politicians look at it, and the politicians turn white, and no pun intended, but turn white and say, don't do anything. If we indicate any sympathy, we're toast, we're done for. And I think it's had an appalling kind of effect on the whole level of political discourse. If I could just duck ahead for a minute, the whole question of who are we, what are we? One of the troubling things for me about this election is that the question of values hasn't been raised at all, or there's a confusion between values with an S at the end and value, which has a dollar equivalent. And the result is, you see, that it means that even if you look at, say, something like the Gonski report on education, the talking is entirely about money. It's entirely about the redistribution of money. And it's barely at all about the quality of education, and it's not at all about the question of creativity, the role of it in encouraging creativity. It's simply, and there's a complete confusion, say, between education and training, as if they're synonymous, as if to say the goal of education is to make somebody ready for next year's labour force. Well, it's more than that. It's the whole question of life. And you'd have to say, there'd be some people who'd say that once the churches went out of business, oh no, that's tactless, but let's say with the regression of the churches, that education really plays an important, tremendously important role in that question of the formulation of values. It's never talked about in the political zone.
I might take up the question. I think the last one was about the preference,
Yep.
the preference flow in the Senate. It's generally understood that there was a central person who took on organising the very minor parties, micro parties, so that preferences, so that they all flowed to each other and bolstered each other and made sure that at least some or one of them would get into the Senate. Now, if that's so, I think that's a new phenomenon in this election. At the 2004 election, we saw senators, or he became Senator Steve Fielding from Family First, I think elected to the Senate with a quota of something like 1.6 or over 1%. Now, it's my understanding that this time a successful senator in Victoria may well enter the Senate with a quota of 0.5, which gives him or her a very low base. Now, obviously, if the micro parties band together against the major parties, that will ultimately give someone a seat in the Senate. And the question is, as a democracy, do we move against that, or do we allow that system to continue? And as I said in my previous remarks, I think that's still an open question. You would have to question the legitimacy of someone being representative in the Senate with a quota as small as that. But on the other hand, that is what the voting system has provided.
Like, we seem to have been unconcerned that the fourth senator from a major party might get in with the quota on a fraction of the hangover vote. But we obviously feel far more confident. We have an idea of either the internal party mechanism in the platform that they'll stand with and what their ideas might be. So it seems to be the uncertainty about ideas, especially a party which seems, or a candidate that seems to have very narrow interests, and how in the full range of the responsibilities of government that person will have any predictability as to what they stand for. Yeah. I think that's part of the issue, not so much, because we've inevitably got senators who, if they were honest about it, probably got, the votes that came for them were follow-on votes from the quotas elsewhere. And I think there was a question about the media, just the extent to which, I don't know if we've covered that adequately, but the whole issue, say the Age, coming out on the eve of the election saying, look, we've changed our view, we think you should all support Labor. I mean, clearly not particularly influential, you'd have to say, so either the Age has lost the dominance of persuasion. But what is the role of the media in these things?
Well, there are a couple of related factors. One is, I think, that the reporting of politics has become more and more like the reporting of sporting events and sometimes theatrical events, because you're looking to see who makes a mistake, who acts stupid, and the result is that sometimes trivial events like Abbott and his suppository and Rudd and the makeup lady, they then become they're human interest stories. And no doubt they will influence how some people vote. It struck me the other day that the reporting of politics is more and more like theatrical criticism, what's going on in the theatre, rather than, say, the kind of reporting you might have of a court, where you say evidence came up and it was tested. And in the end, a verdict was reached. It was on the basis of an informed discussion and evidence and testing. And on the other hand, they say, well, the award went to this group because they got tremendous applause. Everyone clapped like mad. And in a way, the papers play two roles. First of all, they respond to that, but they also help create it.
I know in preparation for this event, The Age, to mention a newspaper, did run a column each Saturday called That Was the Week That Was, or Week 1, Week 2, Week 3, Week 4. And I did keep it because, you often lose track of things, and I wanted to be able to recall relatively what happened. And I had noticed it on the way through, but last night when I went through it, it was highlights and best players, basically, for the week. And then in a column on the right-hand side, it says policies covered, paid parental leave, superannuation, da-da-da-da-da. They were simply named without any inferences to their importance or whatever. And I thought this is a total inversion of the way it should be. It shouldn't be about suppositories and makeup artists. It should be what policies were discussed this week and, what we think of them. But I found it extraordinary that The Age, which has been an august chronicle, has now, done that. And frankly, I found its editorial on the Friday quite astounding.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Nolene. Christians have always been encouraged in adverse times and good times to pray for those who are our leaders, and that's extended to times of oppression under the Caesars and others. So whatever you think and you would like to join me in this prayer, please feel able to as I pray for those who lead us politically. Loving God, we thank you for the freedom we have in this country, the freedom to have elections, to vote, for the results to be fair and uncontested, for all those who have given their efforts towards this contest of ideas and policies. And we pray for those who are elected to public office in the Parliament, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, praying that they might exercise those responsibilities with all care and responsibility and the dignity that goes with those roles. And we pray for the Prime Minister-elect, those who will form his cabinet, those who will come to be in the opposition and other groupings within the Parliament, praying that you might give them your wisdom and your grace. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So thank you very much, and we hope you have a very good day.